In this Blender tutorial, I'll show you how to create this procedural Mars rock and sand material. So here is the procedural material, and after we create the procedural material, I'll show you how to join the material together into this custom node group with all these different custom values to control the material. So we have the overall scale of the entire material, and then we also have just the crack scale. And then we also have this cool distortion value. And then we also have this rock's visibility, so you can make more rocks or less rocks. Then we also have two different colors for the sand, so we have sand color 1 and 2, and then we have some sand settings like the scale of the sand. We also have this sand detail level and this sand detail level 2. Then we have the rocks color, so we have the rocks color 1 and 2, and then we have some different rock settings, so we have the rock scale. So if I want many smaller rocks, I could turn this way up, or just turn it down if I want some very big rocks. Then we also have the detail of the rocks, and then a second amount of detail, and if I turn this one up, the rocks are really going to be quite detailed, or I can turn this down and the rocks are a bit more bumpy. And then we also have the roughness of the material, so I can make it more shiny if I want to. We also have the bump strength, and then finally the displacement strength to actually pop out the rock. And if you'd like to purchase this procedural material and help support the channel, you can get that on my Gumroad store and my Patreon page with the links in the description. And if you'd like to purchase all of my procedural materials, then definitely check out my Ultimate Procedural Material Pack. And my Ultimate Material Pack comes with all of my procedural materials, and they're pre-set up for Blender's asset browser with custom thumbnails, sorted catalogs, and customizable node groups. And when you purchase the Ultimate Material Pack, you'll also get updates with new materials. You can also check out my procedural material packs if you'd like to purchase packs of 10 materials, and you can purchase all of my materials individually on my Gumroad store. And if you'd like to learn how to create any of my procedural materials, you can check out my Blender procedural material tutorial playlist here on YouTube. All the links are in the description. Alright, so I'll now show you the 3D setup if you want to set up the Blender file the same way that I have. So I pressed Shift A, I went here to Mesh, and I added an icosphere because I like to preview procedural materials on spheres. And then right after you add the icosphere, before you move it away or click away, you can click on the Add Icosphere settings, which are right behind me. So just click on that and open it up. And here in the subdivisions, I'm going to turn this up to 6 because I do want it to be very high detailed, because we are going to be using the displacements to actually make the rocks pop out. And so because we're using the displacements need geometry to actually pop out the mesh. And I can close the Add Icosphere settings. Let's also shade this object smooth using the Object Context menu. Then I'm going to scale this object. I'll type in 0.2 and enter just to scale it down so it's a better size, because the default primitive objects are a little bit higher than an average human. So this is like the size of a large boulder when using the real life scale in Blender. So I'll scale this down to like a 0.2, and then I can press Ctrl A and I will apply the scale. So this is the default size of the object. Now, because we are going to be using material displacements, if you go right over here to the render properties and then click on the rendering engine, make sure you are using cycles if you want to use the displacements, because the material displacements will not work in Eevee. So make sure you're using cycles if you want to use the displacements. Now, I also added a camera here, and I just pointed the camera right at the sphere. And then if you click on the camera and you click right over here on the object data properties, I turn the focal length up to 80 just so that it kind of zooms the camera in and makes things look a bit more flat. Now, also to make the camera a square image, you can go right up here to the resolution, and you can just make sure that the X and Y resolution are both the same number, and that way it'll be a square image. Now, as for the lights, I added these 3 different area lights right here. So we have this first one over here on the left side, and so if you press Shift A and go down here to light, you can add the area light. And then over here on the area light settings, I turned the color to a slight yellow color, and I turned the power up to 30. And then here on the shape, I changed this to rectangle, and I changed the X and Y size to make it longer, and that'll give some nice bright lighting on the side of the sphere. Then I duplicated that light and made another one here on the back, and the power of this one I set it to 20 and kind of pointed it here on the back to give a nice rim light on the back of the sphere. And then I also added this light right here, so this one was just another area light, but it's a square light, and I turned the power to 12, and again this is a slight yellow color. So if I press the 0 on the numpad, that's going to go into the camera view. I can hold down the Z button and move my mouse up into the rendered view, and you can see the lighting that that's giving. Now I also wanted to get some nice realistic lighting and reflections, so over here on the world properties, I added in this Machine Shop 02 1K HDRI. So this is a free HDRI from polyhaven.com. Link will be in the description if you'd like to download it. And I downloaded the 1K version and the HDR version of this HDRI. So once you download the HDRI, you can click on the yellow dot next to color, and you can choose environment texture, and then just click on the open button and open up the HDRI. And this will help to give some nice realistic lighting within the world. Now also on the strength here, I turned this to 0.8 so it wasn't quite as strong. Now if you want to make the background transparent so that you can't see the world in the background, you can click here on the render properties and you can go to the film tab and then just click on the transparent button, and that way you can't see the background but it'll still light the scene. And then also to make the colors look a bit nicer, you can go down here to the color management and you can set the view transform to filmic, and you can set the look to very high contrast to pop out the colors and make things more contrasty and saturated. Now because we're using the displacements, I do want to add even more detail to this sphere. So with this sphere selected, I can go here to the modifier properties and I'm going to click on add modifier, and then I'm going to go down here and add the subdivision surface modifier. And it might take a moment to load up because it is already pretty detailed, but I do want lots of geometry for the displacements to use. And then here on the levels viewport and render, I'll just turn these both to 1, so this will subdivide the mesh and give it even more geometry. So you can now click right over here to go to the shading workspace. So on the shading workspace, I have the 3D viewport right over here, and I'm in the rendered mode and I'm in the camera view. And then I also have the shader editor right over here. So I'll click on new to add a new material, and I can rename the material. And I'll rename this to Mars, Rock, and Sand. And then also to make sure that the displacements will work with this material, we need to click right here on the material properties, and we need to open up the settings and go here to the surface. And on the displacement here, we want to change this to displacement and bump, and this is telling the material that it can use the displacements. So I'll just make this smaller so we have more space. And then I'm also going to be using the Node Wrangler add-on to preview the different nodes. So to enable the Node Wrangler, you can click on edit and go to the preferences, and then just go over to the add-ons tab and search for the Node Wrangler and checkmark the Node Wrangler add-on, and I'll show you how to use it in the video. So let's start by adding the texture for the sand. So I'll press Shift A, I'll go to the search, and I'm going to search for the noise texture, and let's drop it here. And then because we turned on the Node Wrangler add-on, you can hold down the Control and Shift key, and then you can select different nodes, and that is going to preview the node on the object. And then I can select the noise texture, and I'm also going to press Control T, and that is using another feature of the Node Wrangler, and it's going to add the texture coordinate and mapping. And I want to take the object and put that into the vector, and then the mapping vector can go into the noise texture. So the object coordinates is going to place the texture on the object more evenly. So we can now change some of the noise texture settings. So because this is the texture for the sand, I want it to be very detailed. So I'm going to turn this to 180 so that it is quite small. And then let's also turn the detail to the max of 15. And I also want to turn the roughness up to like a 0.7 so that it is very grainy. Now I want to make the colors for the sand. So I'll press Shift A, I'll go to the search, and I'm going to search for the mix color node. Let's click on the mix color, and I can drop it here after the noise texture. So I want the factor to be going into the factor of the mix, and so the factor is telling it where it's going to be color A and where it's going to be color B on the material. So this noise texture here, the light and dark values are telling it where it'll be color A and color B. So we can now make the two different colors for A and B. So here on A, I'm going to make this kind of like a brownish reddish color, and then I'll make it very dark. And then here for color B, this is going to be a very similar color. So it's going to be kind of like an orangey color, but it won't be quite as dark. It'll be a bit more brown. And if you want to use the same exact colors that I'm using, then you can click here on color A. You can go to the hex value and you can punch in a hex value of 2D190B. That is color A. And then if you want to use the same color for color B, you can go to the hex value and you can punch in 5E2F14. Now if I zoom into the material, there are those two different colors, but I want to make it a bit more contrasty. So I'll press Shift A, I'll go to the search, and I'm going to search for the color ramp node, and let's put the color ramp in between the noise and the mix. And I can drag these over so I have a bit more space. So now the color ramp is between the noise and the mix, so I can now drag these two values together, and that's going to make it more contrasty. So I'm going to drag the white tab way over to about here, and then I'll also drag the black tab kind of to about here, and you can now see it is more more clear where the lighter red and the darker red is. So I'm now going to click and drag to select these two nodes, and I'll drag them down here because we're going to be using these with the other textures. And then I can click and drag to box select these three nodes, and I'm going to press Ctrl J. That is going to join it together into a frame, and I like to do this just to keep the nodes nicely organized. And then if you select the frame and press F2, that's going to add a label, and I can type in sand. So that'll just help to keep the nodes very organized. Now I also want to add another group of textures, which is just going to be some overall noise. So I'll press Shift A, I'll go to the search, and I'm going to search for another noise texture. Let's drop this down here, and I can Control Shift and select the noise texture to preview it. And then let's take this mapping vector, and I can put that into the vector of the noise texture. And then let's change some of the settings. So I'm going to turn the scale to 10, and let's also turn the detail all the way to the max of 15 so it's more detailed. And here in the roughness, I'll turn this to a 0.53 just so it has a little bit more roughness. So I now want to make the two colors of this noise, and these two colors that we're going to make are going to be the rock colors. So I'll press Shift A, and I'll go to the search, and I'm going to search for the mix color node, and let's drop this here after the noise texture. And just like we did with the nodes up here, we're going to take the noise texture factor, and let's put that into the factor of the mix, and then we can make the colors for A and B. So for color B here, I'm going to click on this, and I'm going to make it fully black. And then here in color A, this is going to be the main color of the rocks. So I'm going to make it kind of like an orangey color, and then I'm going to make it kind of darker so it is brown. And if you want to use the exact same color that I'm using for color A, then you can click on color A and go to the hex value, and you can punch in 2B1509. So I can now click and drag to box select these two nodes, and I'll press Ctrl J just to keep them nicely organized. And if I select the frame and press F2 to add a label, I can just rename this to noise. Alright, so I now want to create the rock texture. So I'll press Shift A, I'll go to the search, and I'm going to search for the Voronoi texture. Let's click on the Voronoi, and I'm going to drop it down here, and then I can Control Shift and select the Voronoi to preview it. And I'm going to click on this F1 here, and I'll change this to distance to edge, and now we have a really cool crack texture. And then let's also take the vector, and I'm going to put that into the vector of the Voronoi so that it is using the object coordinates. And then I can change the scale of this, so I think a scale of 22 looks pretty good. Now this Voronoi texture isn't very detailed, and so I want to mix it with another texture so it has more detail. So I'll press Shift A, I'll go to the search, and I'm going to search for the mix color. And let's put the mix color after the Voronoi texture. And I'm going to drag the Voronoi texture down, and I'm going to put the distance into color B. And then I'm going to take this noise texture here, and I'll put the factor into color A. I'm going to click here on the mix, and I'm going to change this to the linear light. So if I now zoom in, you can see that the Voronoi texture is still there, but it now has all of this noise on the edges. And you can drag the factor around to make it more bright or less bright. And I'm going to turn the factor to a 0.13, and that way the Voronoi is still there, but you can see there's all this little noise here and there. Now I also want to distort this Voronoi texture even more, and I want to add a bit more noise to it. So I'll press Shift A, I'll go to the search, and I'm going to search for another noise texture, and let's put this noise texture here, and I can take the vector and let's put that into the vector of this noise texture. And then I can Control Shift and select this noise texture to preview it, and let's change some of the settings. So I'll turn the scale to 14. I also want to turn the max up to 15 so it's very detailed. And here on the roughness, I'll turn this to a 0.53 so it has a bit more detail. So now I want to mix this noise texture into the vector, and that way it's going to distort the Voronoi texture even more. So I'm going to select this linear light here, and I'll press Shift D to duplicate it, and I'm going to drop the linear light in between the mapping and the Voronoi. So just drop it right here. And I can kind of box select these nodes and bring them in to compress them a little bit. So I'm now going to take this noise texture, and I'm going to take the factor and put that into color B, and then I want this mapping to be going into color A. So I can now Control Shift and select this linear light here to preview the entire thing. So this linear light factor value is going to mix between the mapping and the noise. And the mapping isn't distorted at all, but then the noise is very distorted. So you can see now if I drag the factor, if I turn the factor to 0, it's not being distorted at all. Or if I turn the factor up, you can see there's lots of distortion. So I'm going to turn the factor to just a 0.1, so there's just a little bit of distortion. So now we have a really interesting texture there. So I can click and drag to box select these nodes. I'll press Ctrl J to join them together into a frame, and I can kind of drag these up to just compress them a little bit, make it look a bit nicer. And if I select the frame, I'll press F2 to add a label, and I'm just going to call this rock. Alright, so I'm now going to click and drag and box select these two nodes, and I'll drag them back so I have a bit more space. So I'm now going to be joining these two textures together to make the base color. So I'll press Shift A, I'll go to the search, and I'm going to search for another mix color, and let's drop the mix color right here. And I want to mix the sand and the noise together. So we're going to take the sand mix result right here, and we'll put that into color A of this mix, and then we're going to take this noise mix, and let's put that into color B. So now I can Control Shift and select the mix here, and if I drag the factor around, it's going to be just the rock, or it's just going to be just the sand. But I don't want to have just the rock or just the sand. I want to have both of them, and I want some parts to be the rock and then the rest of it to be the sand. So that is where this rock texture comes in. So if I Control Shift and select this linear light here, you can see there are lighter and darker values, and that is where the rock's going to be and where the sand is going to be. Although it's not very contrasty, it is pretty gray. So to make it more contrasty, I'll press Shift A, I'll go to the search, and I'm going to search for the color ramp, and let's put the color ramp here after the linear light. And then I can drag these two values together, and that is going to make it more contrasty. So I can drag this up here, I'll drag the white tab to kind of about here, and then I'll also drag the black tab to about there. So wherever the white parts are, that is where the rock is going to be, and wherever the black parts are, that is where the sand is going to be. So let's take the color, I can put that here into the factor of the mix, and then I can Control Shift and select the mix to preview it. So now that the color ramp is going into the factor, that is making some parts be the rock and then some parts be the sand. So I can now take this result here, I can put that into the base color of the principled shader, and then I can Control Shift and select the principled shader, and you can now see that as the base color for the material. And also, just for the time being, let's turn this roughness value up so it's a bit more rough and it looks more like rock and sand. Now if you look at the edge of the material, you can see it's not being bumped out at all, it is just very smooth. And so I want to add some values into the displacement to actually make the rocks pop out. So I can take this color ramp color and I'll put that into the displacement, but you can see it's not working properly. That's because we need to convert this color data into displacement data. So I'll press Shift A and I'll go to the search and I'll search for the displacement node, and let's put that here in between the displacement and the color ramp. And I can drag the displacement down here, and you can see it's still not working properly, and that's because we need to take the color and we need to put that into the height value of the displacement. And now you can see it's working properly. And then as I mentioned earlier at the starting of this video, if it is still not working, you need to go here to the material properties, and under the settings surface, you need to set the displacement to displacement and bump, and that is telling the material that it can use the displacements. And you also need to make sure that you're using the Cycles rendering engine to use this setting. So right up here on the render properties, make sure you're using Cycles because Eevee doesn't support material displacements. So I can now just close the setting. So it is working, but it's really sharp and jagged and it's coming out way too much. So I want to turn this scale value way down to make it much less strong. And I'm actually going to turn the scale value to a 0.007, and that way it is much more subtle. So now if I look very closely, you can definitely see it's popping out now, but it is a much better size. Now if I zoom in closely, you can see there is a problem here, and that is that the rock color is kind of just here on the top, but then right over here there's all the sand, but I want all of this to be the rock color as well. And so to fix this, we need to make this value more contrasty, but I don't want it to affect this color ramp because this color ramp is going to change where the rock actually is. So I'll select the color ramp and I'll press Shift D to duplicate it, and I'm going to drop it here between the color ramp and the mix. So because this one is after this color ramp, it's not going to affect the displacement, but it'll still affect the color because it's going here into the mix. So I'm going to select this color ramp and I will hit the backspace, and that is going to reset the color ramp. And I can now click on the white tab and I can drag it over, and you can see as I drag it over, it's adding more of those black colors. So if I want the rocks to be very big, I can turn this way up, or if I want the rocks to be much more subtle, I can turn this way down. So I'm going to drag the white tab to kind of about here in the middle so that much more of the rocks are visible and it is much darker. Alright, so that is looking much better now. Now I also want to be able to control the roughness of the material, so I'm going to take this color ramp right here, and let's take the color and I can put that into the roughness. Now you can see it is way too shiny, so I want to make it more rough, so I'll click on this color ramp and I'll press Shift D to duplicate it, and I'll drop it here before the roughness. And then let's also click on the color ramp and I'll hit the backspace, and that is going to reset the color ramp. Now if I make the colors lighter, it'll be more rough, or if the colors are darker, it'll be more shiny. So I'm going to click on this black tab here, and I'm going to make this fully white so it is very rough. And then here I'll click on this white tab here, and this one is going to be light, but it is just going to be a little bit darker just so that it's a bit more shiny. So by turning this down, you can see it's going to make the rocks more shiny, or if I turn this up, the rocks are going to be more rough. So I'll just make it to about there, so it is pretty rough, but it's just a little bit shiny. Now later on, when we create the custom node group, I want to be able to control the roughness. So I'll press Shift A, I'll go to the search, and I'm going to search for the hue saturation value node, and let's put this here after the color ramp, but before the roughness. And I can just drag these nodes over here just to keep that nicely organized. So the hue saturation value has this value here, and this is going to make the colors lighter or darker. So this value here will control how shiny it is. And so we can use this value later in the custom node group to control the roughness. Now if I zoom in closely, you can see that some places are very smooth, and so that doesn't look very realistic. So I want to add some surface bump over the entire material. So what I'm first going to do is just click on this mix here, and I'll press Shift D to duplicate it, and I'm going to drop it here underneath the hue saturation value because I want to mix in a few of the different textures. So I'm going to go right up here to the sand noise, and let's take the factor of this. I'll bring out a wire, and I'm going to drag this over, and I'm going to put it into color A of the mix. And also I can control Shift and select the mix to preview it. Now I also want to add in some other noise. So let's take this noise here from the noise group. We'll take the factor. I'm going to drag this out, and I'm going to put this into color B of the mix. So now we have color A and B, and I can drag the factor around. So this way it's just using the noise, and then all the way at 0, it's just using the sand. However, I want the surface bump to be different on the sand and the rocks. So we can take this color ramp color. This is the mask of where the rock is and where the sand is. So we'll put the color into the factor. So now you can see if I zoom in here, this is where the sand is. So it'll be nice and bumpy and detailed. And then this is where the rock is. So I can now take this mixed result, and I'm going to put that into the normal, and then I can control Shift and select the principled shader. Now you can see there's some weird shading issues, and that is because I need to convert the color data into normal data that the material can use. So I'll press Shift A, I'll go to the search, and I'm going to search for the bump node, and let's put that in between this mix and the principled shader. And I want to take this result, and I want to put that into the height value, and that is going to actually convert it into normal data. Now it is way too strong, so let's turn the strength way down. So I'm going to turn the strength value to just like a 0.3, but now if I zoom in, you can see the rocks have lots of detail on the surface, and then the sand also has a lot of detail as well. Alright, and that is it. So that is the finished procedural material. So I'm now going to show you how to join this together into a custom node group. So I'm going to click and drag just to box select all the nodes except the material output, and I will press Ctrl G. Ctrl G will join it together into a node group, and then if I press the N key to open the side panel, I can click here on the group tab, and we have the different inputs and outputs. Now here on the outputs, I want to double click on the BSDF, and I want to rename this to shader just because I like that better. Now with the node group selected, if you hit the tab key, that is going to go in and out of the node group. So I can drag the node group over here next to the material output, and I can zoom in, and I can also click here on the side and drag it out to make it bigger. And then I'm going to click here on the material name. I'll press Ctrl C to copy the name. I can click here on the node group and press Ctrl V to paste the name. So now it's called Mars, Rock, and Sand. So then with the node group selected, I'll hit the tab key, and I can zoom out here, and I'm going to go over here to the group input here, which is on the left side, and I can plug all the values up to the group input, and then we can control those values outside of the node group. So I'll just drag the group input down here, and I first want to be able to control the overall scale. So this mapping node is plugged up to all the different textures. So this scale value will control the size of the entire material. So let's take the scale, and I'll put that into the group input. And then if I click here on the inputs, we have the scale, and I can rename this if I want to. And then this is going to be 3 values, but I instead just want it to be 1 value. So I'm going to click on the type here, and I'll change it to float instead. So now that we've changed it to float, we need to turn the default value back to 1, and then if I hit tab to go outside of the node group, you can see it's been turned to 0, so let's just turn it back to 1. But now this will control the entire scale of the material. So I will hit tab to go back into the node group. So the next value that I want to control is the crack scale. So this Voronoi texture here, we have the scale value, and that'll control the size of the cracks. So let's take this scale, I'll drag this over and put it here into the extra socket. I can also make this a bit smaller. And then if I double click on this to rename it, I'm going to rename it to cracks scale. So now outside of the node group here, we just have the crack scale, and I can turn this up and down. So let's go back into the node group. Now I also want to be able to control the distortion, and this linear light right here, if I drag the factor, you can see it's going to make it more and less distorted. So let's take the factor, I can put that into the extra socket here, and then I can double click on this and I'm going to rename it to distortion. And then I also want to be able to control the visibility of the rocks. So if I go right over here to this linear light, I can drag the factor up and down, and you can see there's going to be more rocks or less rocks. So this is a great value to control. So let's take the factor, I'll put that into the extra socket here, and if I double click on this, I'm going to rename this to rocks visibility. Now I also want to be able to control the sand colors. So I'm going to click on the group input and I'm going to drag this up here, and then I'm going to take this, and then I'm going to go up here to the sand and I'll take both of these values, so A and B, and I'll put that into the extra socket, and also B, put that into the extra socket. And then I can double click on these to rename these, and I'm going to rename this to sand color 1, and then this bottom one here, I'm going to rename this one to sand color 2. So outside of the node group, you can see we have both of those two colors. So let's go back into the node group. Now I also want to be able to control the sand scale, so I'll drag the group input over here, and then I can take this scale and I'll put that into the extra socket, and then I can double click on this to rename it, and I'll rename it to sand scale. Now I also want to be able to control the detail levels of the sand. So I can take this detail level, let's put that into the extra socket, and then also this roughness value here, let's put that into the extra socket. And then I can double click on these to rename these. So I'm going to rename this one here to sand detail 1, and I'll copy that name. And then if I double click on this one here, I'm going to rename this one to sand detail 2. Then I want to be able to control the rock colors. So right down here we have this noise and we have this mix here, and we have colors A and B. So let's put A into the extra socket, and then also B, put that into the extra socket, and then I can double click on these to rename these, and I'm going to rename this one to rock color 1, and then also this one down here, I'm going to rename this one to rock color 2. Then I want to be able to control the rock scale, so this scale value here will control the rocks. So let's put the scale into the extra socket here, and I can double click on this to rename it, and I'll rename it to rock scale. And then I also want to be able to control the detail levels of the rock. So let's take this detail here, I'll put that into the extra socket, and also this roughness here, I'll put that into the extra socket. And then I can double click on this to rename it, and this one will be rock detail 1, and then this one here, this is going to be rock detail 2. And then I also want to be able to control the roughness of the material. So if I drag the group input right over here, we have this hue saturation value, and that'll make it lighter or darker. So that'll control the roughness. So I'll put that into the extra socket here. So put the value into the extra socket, and I can double click on this, and I'm going to rename this one to roughness. And then I also want to be able to control the bump strength. So this bump here, that'll just control the strength. So let's drag this over, put that into the extra socket. And then if I double click on this, I'm going to rename this one to bump strength. And then finally, I want to be able to control the displacement strength. So we'll take the scale here, the displacement, I'll drag this over, put that into the extra socket. And if I click here, I can drag this down to have more space. And then this one, I'm going to rename to displacement strength. Alright, so I can now click on this group input, and I'm going to drag it back here under the texture coordinate, and I'll hit the tab key to go outside of the node group, and I'll press the N key to close that side panel. And there we have it. So there is the finished material. So let's just review the material. So we have the overall scale, then we also just have the crack scale, we also have the cool distortion value, and also this rocks visibility. And then we also have the different colors. So here's the sand color 1 and also sand color 2. We also have just the sand scale, and then we also have some detail levels of the sand. Then we have the rock colors, so we have the rock colors 1 and 2, and then we also have the rock scale, so we can make very small rocks or some bigger rocks. And then we also have the rock detail, so rock detail 1, and also I really like rock detail 2 because you can make this rock super detailed and kind of grainy, or you can make it kind of lumpy. Then we also have the roughness of the material, we also have the bump strength to make it more or less bumpy, and then finally we have the displacement strength. So I hope you found this tutorial helpful, and thank you for watching. And if you'd like to help support me and my channel and purchase the material, you can get that on my Gumroad store and my Patreon page. The links are in the description. And you can also check out my Ultimate Blender Procedural Material Pack if you'd like to purchase all of my materials. And you can also check out my Procedural Material Packs to purchase packs of 10 materials. And if you'd like to learn how to create any of my procedural materials, you can check out my Blender Procedural Material Tutorial playlist here on YouTube. All the links are in the description. And if you'd like to help support the channel here on YouTube, then you can also check out the YouTube memberships by clicking down there on that join button. And by joining the YouTube memberships, you'll be helping to support the channel monthly, and you'll get get some cool perks here on YouTube. And if you found this video helpful and you'd like to send me a little tip, you can also use the super thanks feature here on YouTube to send me a little tip in the comments. And I do appreciate all of your support. But I hope you found this helpful, and thanks for watching.